Histology, welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit today about the integumentary system, or the skin, taking a look at some of the different parts of that and what's involved with it. This will be the last chapter before we actually test on this stuff, so this will get us ready for being the last bit of material before exam 2. So really when we look at the skin, to me it's really not super difficult. There's a few things that are a little bit more key on it, but it's really not too bad. So what does the skin do for us? Well, it does a number of things. First off, it covers the outer part of the body, and one of the things that does, knowing what stratified squamous epithelium is we know that's going to be a good protective barrier. Protects against chemical injuries, protects against physical injuries, protects against infections. The other thing is, with that keratin being a waterproof protein, it stops water from getting into us too easily or water from getting out of us too easily, which you wouldn't think is a big thing, but when you get a burn, that's one of the things that can happen really easy if you damage the skin bad enough, is you can lose a lot of moisture out of the body. It does house some of our sensory receptors, and in terms of physiology, one of the biggest things it's involved with is actually vitamin D synthesis. And then the other thing we can see with this is it does excrete a number of substances in some of our glands, our oil and sweat glands, things along those lines. So really when we look at this, it's really two main layers to it, and then the kind of the layer that a lot of times we talk with it, which is technically not part of the skin, but it underlies it. So you have what is called the epidermis. This is just, for the most part, that epithelial tissue, that stratified, squamous, the keratinized version of it, and the different layers that compose that. Where the other underlying tissue underneath that is called the dermis. This is going to have connective tissue, some loose, a lot of dense irregular connective tissue that helps hold everything in place. We're going to see that there is this papillae that kind of go up and down these ridges that help provide more surface area so you can't peel them apart as easily. And then housed within that dermis, we're going to see that there is a number of different glands, things like sweat glands, oil glands, hair and nails are involved in that. So this kind of shows the different layers of skin. You can see the upper part there is the upper epidermis from the basement membrane up. You can see that folded layer that's going across there, that papillary layer, the dermapapilla. Just beneath that, we have the dermis, which we'll see when we get to the dermis, but it is divided into 2 layers. And then underlying the dermis, which is technically not part of the dermis, and technically it's not part of the skin, but we talk about the subcutaneous layer. Hypodermis is another thing we sometimes call that. So beneath that dermis. The other thing we see with this is a lot of different appendages, things like sweat glands, oil glands, the hair follicles. We'll take a look at all these things there. I will show you some of that stuff on the second show of this with the slides looking at some of this. And again, this is showing a few more of them. Things like the erector pili muscle makes your hair stand up on an end. Sweat glands, the pore on the surface there, a few other things. Subcutaneous, like I said, also called the hypodermis, technically not part of the skin, but it's going to have a lot of areolar connective tissue and mainly adipose. Helps to insulate, helps to loosely bind your skin to the underlying tissue, which is mainly muscle in a lot of areas. So what we're going to look at on this first one and finish off here is we will look at the epidermis and the different layers that compose that. And what are some cells involved with that. So we're going to see with the epidermis, there's technically 5 layers. Depends on what we're talking about. On the palms of the hands, soles of the feet, you're going to see what we have thick skin. It will have all 5 layers. Every place else, so like on the arm and that, it will have 4 of these layers. So kind of from outside in, we have what is called the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidium, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale is the innermost layer right along the basement membrane, hence basal in the name. So you can see the different layers of it right here. You can see basale, spinosum, granulosum, lucidium, and corneum. So what we're going to do is we're going to work our way through these and talk a little bit about what's going on in each layer. So the bottom layer, the stratum basale, sometimes called the stratum germinativum. This is usually just a single cell layer thick. The main thing that's going on here is there is a lot of cell division taking place. These cells are highly mitotic. They are going to divide. As they divide, it pushes some of those cells above them up, pushes some more cells up above them up. And what at some point starts at the basal layer, sternal layer, is going to be all the way up at the stratum corneum, and that is what is continually repopulating the skin with cells. It does have melanocytes down in this area and some scent cells called Merkel cells. It is well attached to the basement membrane there, and they are, all these cells, again, very well attached to one another. So you can see it is that bottom layer going along that dermal papillae. The stratum spinosum. This one gets its name because the cells kind of look spiny. I always kind of liken them to like level 4 on Super Mario Brothers. You had the little things with the spiny shells on them. Really what this comes from is when we dehydrate the tissue, all those desmosomes that were attaching the cells to one another, the membrane pulls back a little bit, but those desmosomes stay attached, so the cells shrink a little bit, and it gives it this spiny look. And that's how it gets its name. In real life, you wouldn't see these spines around the outside of the cell. They would just be flush to one another. But when they're dehydrated, like I said, the desmosomes stay poking out, and because of that, they do have this spiny look to them. You can kind of see it right here. This is going to be that layer working its way up. To me, the easiest way to differentiate this layer is when you get to the next layer above that one, which we'll talk about in a second, that stratum granulosum. You're going to see these cells start filling with granules. We know the basal layer is that bottom layer. We know where the granules of keratin start filling in. The spinosum is that layer in between those. And you can see if you zoom in on it a little bit more, you can see those desmosomes all connecting to one another, giving it that artifactual spiny look to it, like I was talking about. Further out from this layer is going to be the stratum granulosum. These are making a couple different types of granules. I'm not worried about the two main types here, but the main idea, these are filling up with the components that are going to make up keratin. This keratin makes the skin pretty much waterproof, means we don't lose water out, we don't get stuff coming in. It also means that everything above this stratum granulosum layer is going to be dead. So the outer part of that epidermis is not living. And you can kind of see this one right here. It's where that starts to fill in. You start getting that granular look to it. And what you can see above this one in just a second here, just above that, oops. Hit the wrong arrow, sorry. Just above that is going to be the stratum lucidium. These ones, they lose their nuclei. They get very kind of see-through almost. So lucid means clear, if you actually break down the meaning of the word. So if you're thinking lucidly, you're thinking clearly. This is the one that we see only in thick skin. So this layer would only be found on the palms of the hand and soles of the feet. We would not see it in like the skin of the arm or anything else like that. And you can see that layer right here. This to me is the one that a lot of times I probably wouldn't ask you to identify. It is quite difficult to see. Not always the easiest to find. Sometimes stains well, sometimes it doesn't stain well, but sometimes you can see that definition like you can in this slide. Sometimes you can't. And then the outermost layer here is what is called the stratum corneum. These cells are fully dead, no nuclei. They get really, really flat. They look like flaky, crusty dough. I mean, like I always kind of say like a baklava, that phyllo dough that we talked about before. Lots and lots of layers. Depending on the thickness of the skin, this will be 10, 20 layers thick to 50, 80 layers thick. And you can see it on this picture right here on the upper part here. So thick skin versus thin skin. Like I said, thick skin, palms of the hands, soles of the feet. It has all 5 layers and a very thick keratinized layer on the surface, much thicker than you'd see on the thin skin. What we don't see here is we don't see hair follicles, so no hair on the palm of your hands, no hair on the soles of your feet. Thin skin we're going to see is everywhere with the exception of those areas. It does not have that stratum lucidium. The other thing is the other layers tend to be a little bit thinner, especially the stratum corneum. This may have sweat glands, hair follicles, things like that present in them. So you can see the thick skin here with all of its different layers. That stratum lucidium is present. You can see it just beneath the stratum corneum, and you can see that same thing right here, that thick corneum on the surface. Again, you can see this one, lucidium's not super clear to pull out. It's probably the one I wouldn't expect you to be able to identify in a slide. Where on the thin skin, you can see only a very thin corneum at the surface. There is no stratum lucidium. You can see that granulosum and then the spiny layer underneath that. So you can see some of the other layers are definitely thinner, but that stratum corneum much, much thinner and no stratum lucidium. The other thing to talk about real quick on these ones before we'll look at a slide of the epidermis is going to be just the main cell types that are found in the epidermis. Those stratified squamous cells, because they fill up with keratin in the skin, we call these keratinocytes, but those are your normal epithelial cells. They are going to reproduce and work their way upward as they develop. The other really major one I want you to know about is the melanocyte. These are specialized cells that sit down near that basement membrane and they produce what is called melanin, which is going to give you your skin color. So if you're darker skinned, it is going to be what causes that. If you are a little bit lighter skinned and you go out in the sun and you get a tan, that is also the melanin. The whole idea with the melanin is it helps to absorb UV radiation, and what we do is we deposit it in those lower layers of the skin in response to UV damage on the skin, and this helps to protect you against damaging those dividing skin cells. People that their descendants and ancestors came from areas that are closer to the equator tend to have darker skin colors because of that, and that is again kind of an evolutionary thing where there's much more protection there. As people left Africa and started migrating to different areas of the world, one of the things that we saw is as you get further and further north, on average, skin color tends to lighten up a little bit, and that is actually just a trade-off about UV protection versus vitamin D synthesis. You need a little bit of UV radiation to make vitamin D. As you start getting to those really, really higher, like 45th parallel and above that, up into those more Nordic countries, you tend to have much lighter skin to get enough vitamin D. So it is that gradation, that trade-off of UV protection versus vitamin D synthesis that gives us that gradation of skin colors. Other things in there is some kind of phagocytic cells called Langerhans cells, and Merkel cells are these really just kind of nerve endings going just into the bottom of that basement membrane to through the basement membrane to give us some light touch sensation. So you can see the melanocyte right here kind of looks like a little jellyfish. It has these little legs that go out of it there. Those melanin granules will get released and they get taken up by those cells in the lower layers. It's those bottom couple layers just above the stratum basale. Again, we're protecting the dividing cells because what cells can get cancer? Dividing cells. One of the things you won't see is you will never see a skin cancer of the stratum corneum. The main reason is the stratum corneum is dead. So, and this process is taking a lot of tyrosine amino acids and making them into a chain that makes these melanin, and again, it donates it out to other cells, and is taken up by cells around this melanocytes in those bottom couple of layers, again, protecting the dividing cells against sun damage. And you can see here, this would be a pigmented one here. You can see that bottom layer on this where it has that pigment in that layer. And you can see it even a little bit better here. Sometimes, I mean, you can get differences in, like with freckles in it, that's a concentration of these in a particular area. Generally, the number of monocytes person to person is not particularly that different, but it's the type and difference within the melanin that gives some of those differences in skin color. And again, the whole idea here is to put these on the sunny side of those cells to protect the dividing cells from any UV damage. UV damage leads to mutations in those dividing cells, and any mutation that happens long enough, that is a risk for skin cancer. Like I said, the Langerhans cells are a macrophage. They get into the stratum spinosum, they take in stuff and are antigen presenting cells, present it to other immune cells, cells that were actually, I mean, we talked about lymphocytes with the blood, but it was be presenting it to the type of lymphocyte called a T cell. And again, Merkel cells are these touch receptors that are present in that stratum basale. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at this under the scope on the digital slide here, and then we'll talk about the dermis next time. Histology. So we're looking at skin slide here. I apologize for these ones. These are the best ones I found, but the only thing that's kind of a bummer is they are upside down. So what we're going to be working on is from the basement layer is actually at the, you can kind of see the basement membrane would be right along this area. And then that stratum basale would be about along this bottom layer. And this is probably a pigmented skin slide here. You can see that'd be the basal layer right here, the stratum basale. Just above that, all this kind of inner middle layer here is the stratum spinosum. And then the stratum granulosum, you can kind of see they're filling up right here. It would be right here on the thin skin. And this would be stratum corneum on that thin skin right along here. The other slide here, this is a thick skin slide. Definitely a little bit better version of this one. This is one you can actually see the stratum stratum lucidium on. So again, you can see basement membrane would be right along here, along these dermal papilla. That bottom layer right there is going to be the stratum basale. You can see where the stratum granulosum starts to fill in between this layer and this layer. Right here is the stratum spinosum. Stratum granulosum right here. You can then see this clear, more clear line that's just above that granulosum. That is that stratum lucidium of thick skin. So this is the sole of the foot on this one. And then finally, you can see right here, all that stratum corneum. Just to show you one other thing, since I have it right here, to kind of give you the different layers of this. So you can see the darker pink right down here. That would be epidermis. This layer from about here to somewhere right around in here would be the dermis. And then you can see as we get a lot more adipose tissue up here, that would actually be the hypodermis or subcutaneous tissue. Next time when we look at this stuff, we'll look at some of these dermal structures and what's involved with those.